My parents walked away from me after their divorce when I was just 13. They left me in my aunt's care and erased me from their lives, as if I had never existed. Years passed in silence, until the day I inherited my grandfather's estate. Suddenly, the same parents who had got me came knocking, claiming to remember they still had a son. So I was 13 when my parents dropped the bomb. Not the kind of bomb you see coming from miles away with screaming matches and thrown dishes. Nope, this was one of those quiet explosions that just leave you standing there wondering what the heck just happened. I remember sitting at our kitchen table, the same one where I'd eaten countless bowls of Lucky Charms and done homework that I'd inevitably forgotten about until the last minute. Mom and Dad sat across from me, looking like they were about to deliver a PowerPoint presentation about quarterly earnings or something equally thrilling. They had this weird, formal tone, like they'd rehearsed this whole thing in the mirror. They needed more space, they said. That's the line they went with. More space. Like our 3-bedroom suburban house had suddenly shrunk to the size of a studio apartment. I wanted to ask them if they'd tried rearranging the furniture, but even at 13, I could read the room well enough to know this wasn't about square footage. The whole thing felt surreal, honestly. One day I'm complaining about having to mow the lawn and take out the trash, and the next day I'm getting a crash course in custody arrangements. Dad had already found himself a nice little apartment across town with his new girlfriend, Sarah. Apparently, she'd been in the picture for a while, but hey, what do I know? I'm just a kid living in the house. Mom, meanwhile, had her own surprise waiting in the wings. Meet Derek, her co-worker from the insurance company where she'd been working for the past 5 years. Derek was one of those guys who wore polo shirts tucked into khakis and thought putting pineapple on pizza was a height of culinary adventure. He had 2 kids from his previous marriage, both around my age, and apparently our house was going to become some kind of twisted Brady Bunch experiment. The custody arrangement they worked out was probably designed by someone who'd never actually been a kid. Summers with Dad, school year with Mom and her new instant family. It sounded neat and tidy on paper, like dividing up the furniture or deciding who gets which streaming service subscription. But nobody asked me what I thought about spending 3 months every year in a different state with a man who'd basically become a stranger overnight. The first few weeks after the announcement were the weirdest of my life. Dad started acting like we were buddies instead of father and son, asking about my plans for high school and whether I was interested in any girls. It was like he'd read some manual called How to Connect with Your Teenage Son After Abandoning Your Family, and was checking off boxes. Meanwhile, Mom was in full nesting mode with Derek, rearranging furniture and talking about how excited she was for us all to be one big happy family. I felt like a piece of luggage that nobody really wanted to claim at the airport. You know that feeling when you're the last person picked for dodgeball? Imagine that. But it's your own parents doing the picking, and the game is your entire life. The house started changing almost immediately. Derek's kids, Brandon and Ashley, moved in before the divorce was even finalized. Brandon was 14 and had this annoying habit of leaving his gaming headset volume so loud you could hear the explosions from 3 rooms away. Ashley was 12 and apparently thought our bathroom was her personal spa, leaving hair straighteners and makeup scattered across every surface like some kind of beauty supply store had exploded. Mom kept trying to force these family bonding moments that felt about as natural as a root canal. Movie nights where Derek would pick some action flick from the 90s that nobody wanted to watch. Dinner conversations where everyone pretended to care about each other's day while secretly checking their phones under the table. It was like living in a sitcom, except nobody was laughing at the right parts. The worst part wasn't even the new living situation. It was watching Mom transform into this completely different person. She started wearing different clothes, listening to Derek's music, and even changed her coffee order from a simple black coffee to some complicated caramel macchiato thing with extra foam. It was like she decided that being herself wasn't good enough anymore, so she was going to become whoever Derek wanted her to be. Dad wasn't much better on his end. Every phone call was about how great his new life was going, how Sarah made the best lasagna, and how they were thinking about getting a dog. A dog! The man who wouldn't let me have a goldfish because it was too much responsibility was suddenly ready to commit to a German shepherd. School became my escape, which is saying something because I'd never been what you'd call an academic superstar. But suddenly, staying late for study groups and joining random clubs seemed way better than going home to whatever family dinner disaster was waiting for me. I joined the chess club even though I was terrible at chess. I volunteered to help with the school newspaper even though my writing skills were about as polished as a rusty hubcap. My grades actually started improving, probably because I was spending so much time anywhere but home. Teachers began commenting on how focused I'd become, how mature I seemed for my age. Little did they know I was just desperately trying to find somewhere I belonged, somewhere I wasn't treated like an inconvenient reminder of someone's past life. The summer arrangement with Dad turned out to be exactly as awkward as I'd expected. Sarah tried way too hard to be the cool stepmom, constantly asking if I needed anything and suggesting activities like we were at some kind of vacation resort. Their apartment had one of those open floor plans where you could hear everything happening everywhere, which meant I got to listen to their entire relationship playing out in real time. Dad kept trying to make up for lost time by cramming a year's worth of father-son activities into 3 months. We went fishing even though neither of us had ever shown any interest in fishing. We went to baseball games even though we'd never watched baseball together at home. It felt like he was following some divorced dad playbook, hitting all the required activities to maintain his parental license. The strangest part was how quickly I adapted to feeling like I didn't really belong anywhere. Home wasn't home anymore, and neither was Dad's place. I was like a foreign exchange student in my own life, always polite, always careful not to take up too much space or cause any trouble. I learned to pack light for those summer trips because it was easier than trying to figure out what belonged where. I started keeping a journal that summer, writing down all the weird observations about my new reality. Like how Sarah always bought the name brand cereal, but Derek insisted on generic everything. Or how Mom would get this panicked look whenever Derek's ex-wife called about the kids' schedules. These little details became fascinating to me, like I was an anthropologist studying the mating rituals of recently divorced suburban Americans. By the end of that first summer, I'd made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to be the sad kid from the broken home who spent his whole life trying to win back parents who'd already moved on. I was going to figure out how to build my own life, with people who actually wanted me around. I just had no idea how dramatically that decision would reshape my entire future, or how the adults in my life would react when they realized I'd stopped playing their game entirely. Looking back now, I can see that summer was when I first started thinking like an adult instead of a kid. Not because I want to grow up fast, but because I had to. When the people who are supposed to take care of you start treating you like a scheduling conflict, you learn pretty quickly that you're on your own. What I didn't know was that this independence I was building would eventually become the very thing that would save me when my family came crawling back years later, hands outstretched and excuses ready. Life with Mom and her new blended family experiment quickly turned into something resembling a low-budget reality show that nobody wanted to watch. Derek's kids, Brandon and Ashley, had apparently received a memo that their mission was to make my existence as miserable as humanly possible. Brandon had this charming habit of eating my leftovers and then claiming he thought they were communal property. Ashley would use my shampoo until the bottle was empty, then act shocked when I mentioned it. But the real masterpiece was when they convinced Derek that I was the one leaving messes around the house. Suddenly, every dirty dish and every piece of trash became my responsibility, even when I'd been at school all day. When I finally worked up the courage to talk to Mom about it, she gave me this speech about being more flexible and understanding that everyone was adjusting. She used phrases like blended family dynamics and transition period like she'd been reading self-help books about stepfamilies. The message was crystal clear. I needed to adapt to them, not the other way around. Derek himself wasn't exactly evil, just painfully oblivious. He was one of those guys who thought he could win me over by sharing random facts about insurance claim processing or showing me YouTube videos of people doing stupid stunts. He'd pat my shoulder and call me sport while completely missing the fact that his kids were making my life a living nightmare. The breaking point came during a family dinner when Brandon accidentally knocked over my glass of orange juice all over my homework that was due the next day. When I got upset, Derek actually had the nerve to lecture me about overreacting and being too sensitive. That's when I realized I was outnumbered in my own home, and nobody was coming to my rescue. That night, I called my Aunt Linda, Mom's sister. She'd always been the cool aunt who remembered my birthday and actually listened when I talked, unlike the rest of my family. She didn't treat conversations with me like some kind of obligatory check-in with a distant relative. Linda had never married, never had kids of her own, but she had this amazing antique shop downtown that was like stepping into a time machine. Every item had a story, and she knew all of them. When I told her about the situation at home, she didn't give me any of that family is family nonsense. She just asked if I wanted to come stay with her for a while. I didn't even pack much. Just threw some clothes and my Xbox into a duffel bag and told Mom I was going to stay with Linda for the weekend. The weekend turned into a week, then a month, and eventually became permanent. Mom put up a token protest, but I could tell she was actually relieved. One less complication in her new life. Living with Linda was like discovering what normal felt like for the first time in years. She had rules, but they made sense. Clean up after yourself, help with the shop when you can, and don't be a jerk. Revolutionary concepts, apparently. Her house was this old Victorian place with creaky floors and windows that actually opened, unlike the hermetically sealed suburban box I'd escaped from. The antique shop became my second home. After school, I'd walk the 10 blocks downtown and spend my afternoons learning about estate sales and auction houses. Linda taught me how to spot valuable pieces, how to research items online, and most importantly, how to talk to people without feeling like I was constantly apologizing for existing. She never made me feel like a burden or a charity case. When I offered to help pay for groceries with the money I'd saved from birthdays and odd jobs, she just smiled and said I'd contribute by helping her reorganize the shop's inventory system. It was the first time in years that someone had treated me like I had something valuable to offer instead of just being another mouth to feed. The customers at the shop became like an extended family of sorts. There was Mrs. Henderson, who came in every Tuesday looking for Depression-era glassware and always brought homemade cookies. Mr. Rodriguez collected vintage tools and taught me how to properly restore rusty metal. These people actually care about what I had to say, unlike the forced interactions back at Mom's house. School became bearable again. I wasn't walking on eggshells anymore, wondering what fresh drama would be waiting for me at home. My grades improved not because I suddenly became a genius, but because I could actually focus on learning instead of surviving. I joined the debate team, which turned out to be perfect training for all the family drama that was still to come. Linda never badmouthed my parents, which I appreciated. She just listened when I needed to vent and offer perspective when I asked for it. She had this way of asking the right questions that helped me figure things out for myself instead of just telling me what to think. The funny thing was, once I stopped being around all the time, Mom's calls became more frequent. Suddenly, she was interested in my grades, my friends, what I was doing with my free time. It was like I had become more interesting to her once I wasn't cluttering up her new family dynamic. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I was learning to play the long game. Dad's summer visits became less awkward too, probably because I wasn't this resentful kid anymore. I had my own life, my own interests, and my own space to retreat to when his attempts at bonding became too much. Sarah actually seemed relieved that I wasn't this angry teenager disrupting their perfect little setup. By my junior year of high school, I basically created my own family unit with Linda and the shop. I was working part-time, saving money for college, and actually looking forward to the future instead of just surviving day by day. I thought I had everything figured out, that I'd successfully navigated the worst part of my life and come out stronger on the other side. What I didn't know was that my real family was about to get some very interesting news that would bring them all crawling back into my life with a vengeance. And this time, they wouldn't be interested in my emotional well-being or building relationships. They'd be interested in something much more tangible, something that would reveal their true colors in ways I never could have imagined. College was going better than I'd expected. I'd managed to get into a decent state school with a partial scholarship, and Linda had insisted on helping with the rest. I was majoring in business with a focus on entrepreneurship, partly because of all the stuff I'd learned at the antique shop, and partly because I wanted to build something that was entirely mine. My parents had become these distant figures who sent obligatory birthday cards and made awkward phone calls on major holidays. Dad would ask about my classes like he was interviewing a stranger, and Mom would update me on Derek's kids like I was supposed to care that Brandon had made the JV basketball team or Ashley had gotten her braces off. The graduation ceremony was probably the most telling moment of this whole saga. Linda drove 4 hours to be there, brought flowers, and took about 1,000,000 photos like I was the first person in history to get a college degree. My parents? Complete no-shows. Dad called the night before with some excuse about Sarah's work schedule, and Mom texted an hour before the ceremony saying Derek's ex-wife had created some emergency with the custody arrangements. I wasn't even surprised anymore. Disappointed? Maybe a little. But mainly I just felt this weird sense of validation that I'd been right about them all along. Linda was the only family I needed. And she'd proven it over and over again while they'd proven the exact opposite. 3 months after graduation, I was working at a marketing firm in the city and living in a tiny apartment that cost way too much but felt like a palace because it was mine. I was finally starting to feel like a real adult with actual prospects when I got this letter that changed everything. The return address said it was from a law firm I'd never heard of, which immediately made me think I was being sued for something. College debt? Unpaid parking tickets? My mind went through every possible financial disaster as I opened the envelope with shaking hands. Turns out my grandfather on Dad's side had passed away 6 months earlier. Grandpa Joe, who I hadn't seen since I was maybe 8 years old. Dad had mentioned it briefly in one of our quarterly check-in calls, but he'd made it sound like no big deal. Just an old man who'd lived a full life and gone peacefully in his sleep. What Dad apparently forgot to mention was that Grandpa Joe had been keeping tabs on our family situation. The letter from his attorney explained that my grandfather had been horrified to learn about the divorce and how I'd been basically abandoned by both parents. He'd spent his final years quietly investigating what had happened to his grandson. The number in the letter made me read it 3 times before it sank in. $1.2 million. Grandpa Joe had left me his entire estate, bypassing Dad completely. The attorney's letter was pretty clear about why. My grandfather believed that parents who abandon their children don't deserve to benefit from family wealth, and he wanted to make sure I had the resources to build a life without depending on people who'd already proven they couldn't be counted on. There were conditions. Of course, I had to finish college, which I'd already done. I had to wait until I was 25 to access the full amount, which meant 3 more years. Until then, I'd get a monthly allowance that was honestly more than I was making at my entry-level job. And there was one more condition that made me smile. I had to donate at least 10% to charity, because Grandpa Joe believed that money should help others, not just make rich people richer. I sat in my tiny apartment holding this letter and feeling like I was in some kind of alternate reality. The same grandfather who'd seemed like a distant figure from my childhood had apparently been paying attention the whole time. He'd seen what my parents had done, and he decided to do something about it. The smart thing would have been to keep this information to myself. The attorney had made it clear that there was no legal requirement to tell anyone about the inheritance. But I was young and maybe a little naive, and I thought my parents should know that their son was going to be okay despite their best efforts to mess up my life. I called Linda first. Of course, she cried, which surprised me because Linda wasn't much of a crier. She said Grandpa Joe had always been a good man, and that he would have been proud of how I'd turned out. Then she said something that should have been a warning. She hoped this wouldn't bring the wrong kind of attention from people who might want to take advantage of me. Looking back, I should have listened to that warning more carefully. Because somehow, and I still don't know exactly how, word about my inheritance made its way back to my parents faster than gossip spreads through a small-town church. The first sign was a Facebook friend request from Dad, which was weird because he'd never shown any interest in social media before. Then Mom started liking old photos of me from high school, which was strange because she barely acknowledged those years when they were actually happening. But the real confirmation came when they both called me within the same week, asking about my life with a level of interest they hadn't shown since I was 13. Dad wanted to know about my job, my apartment, my future plans. Mom was suddenly concerned about whether I was eating well, and if I needed anything from my place. It was like watching 2 people who'd been sleepwalking for years suddenly wake up and remember they had a son. The timing was just a little too convenient to be coincidental. The strangest part was how they both started working their way up to the same question without actually asking it directly. Dad would mention how proud he was of my independence, then casually bring up how expensive everything was getting these days. Mom would talk about how mature I'd become, then somehow segue into stories about Derek's financial struggles with his ex-wife's demands for higher child support. I played dumb for a while, partly because I was curious to see how far they'd go, and partly because some petty part of me was enjoying watching them dance around the subject, after years of feeling invisible to them. It was surreal to suddenly be the center of their attention, even if I knew exactly why their interest had been renewed. The transformation was absolutely incredible to watch. Suddenly, I went from being the kid they'd rather forget about to their long-lost beloved son, who they'd apparently been missing terribly this whole time. Dad started calling every Sunday like clockwork, which was hilarious considering he'd gone months without calling during my actual teenage years when I might have needed to hear from him. Mom's approach was more subtle but equally transparent. She began sending care packages to my apartment filled with homemade cookies and little notes about how proud she was of the man I'd become. The same woman who'd told me to be more flexible when her stepkids were making my life miserable was now acting like Mother of the Year. The really pathetic part was how obvious they were being about it. Dad would work into every conversation how expensive things had gotten, how Sarah's medical bills were piling up, how his business was struggling in the current economy. He'd throw in these little comments about how families should stick together and help each other out during tough times. Mom went the emotional route, talking about regrets and how she wished things had been different when I was younger. She'd mentioned Derek's job situation and how stressed everyone was about finances, then quickly changed the subject like she wasn't fishing for information about my financial situation. The breakthrough moment came when Dad actually drove 6 hours to visit me at my apartment. This was the same man who'd missed my high school graduation because it conflicted with Sarah's nephew's birthday party. Suddenly, he was making road trips to check on my well-being and see how I was doing. He walked around my tiny place like he was touring a mansion, commenting on how nice everything looked and how responsible I'd become. Then he started asking questions about my job, my salary, my savings plan. When I mentioned that I was doing okay financially, his eyes lit up like Christmas morning. That's when the real show began. He launched into the story about a business opportunity he'd been presented with, something about buying rental properties in an up-and-coming neighborhood. All he needed was some initial investment capital, and he was sure I'd want to get in on the ground floor of what was basically a guaranteed moneymaker. I nodded along and made interested noises while internally marveling at his audacity. This was the man who taught me that family was about being there for each other, right before he demonstrated the exact opposite for the better part of a decade. Now he was back with his hand out, acting like we'd always been best buddies. Mom's approach was more sophisticated. She invited me to dinner at Derek's house, which I accepted out of morbid curiosity. The whole family was there, including Brandon and Ashley, who were suddenly being incredibly nice to me. It was like someone had given them a script about how to behave around their long-lost stepbrother. Derek kept talking about family bonds and how important it was for everyone to support each other. Mom kept bringing up memories from when I was little, stories I'd never heard her tell before. The whole performance was so rehearsed that I half expected them to break into song at some point. Then came the pitch. Derek's business was going through a rough patch, and they were worried about losing the house. Ashley was applying to colleges, and they needed money for tuition. Brandon needed a car for his senior year. The medical bills from Derek's recent surgery were overwhelming them. They didn't ask directly, but the implication was clear. I was family, and family helps family. They'd made some mistakes in the past, but now was our chance to come together and really be the family we'd always been meant to be. The logic was almost impressive in its complete disconnect from reality. I listened to the whole presentation with the same fascination you'd have watching a train wreck in slow motion. These people who'd essentially written me off when I was an inconvenient teenager were now expecting me to finance their various life choices because we happened to share some DNA. The beautiful part was how they kept talking about family loyalty and sticking together, apparently forgetting that I'd spent the last few years learning exactly what family loyalty looked like from Linda. Real family doesn't abandon you when things get complicated. Real family doesn't suddenly remember you exist when they need something. I told them I'd think about their various requests and get back to them. The relief on their faces was almost comical. They probably went to bed that night planning how they'd spend my money, dividing up the inheritance they'd assumed I'd hand over like some kind of family ATM. What they didn't realize was that I'd already made my decision years ago, back when I was 15 and learned that the only person I could really count on was myself. They were about to get a very expensive lesson in consequences, and frankly, it was long overdue. The next few weeks were fascinating from a psychological perspective. Both parents ramped up their contact, checking in on me with increasing frequency. Dad started sending articles about real estate investment and how young people should think about building wealth early. Mom began sharing memories about my childhood and talking about how much she regretted the way things had gone. It was like watching two people who'd never shown any interest in being my parents suddenly decide they wanted to audition for the role. The timing was so perfectly aligned with their financial needs that it would have been insulting if it wasn't so predictably pathetic. I was about to give them both a reality check they'd never forget. I decided to put them out of their misery and arrange a meeting. Called both of them separately and suggested we meet at this little coffee shop downtown, neutral territory where nobody could make a scene. The anticipation in their voices was almost painful to listen to. They probably spent the week planning their spending sprees. Dad showed up first, wearing what looked like a new shirt and actually carrying a small gift bag. Mom arrived 10 minutes later with Derek in tow for moral support, I guess. They all had this weird energy, like kids on Christmas morning who were trying really hard to act casual about what they knew was waiting under the tree. The small talk was excruciating. Dad asked about my apartment, my job, whether I was seeing anyone special. Mom wanted to know if I was eating enough vegetables and getting enough sleep. Derek just sat there nodding along like he was part of some important family reunion, instead of being the guy who'd helped make my teenage years miserable. I ordered a black coffee and watched them all get fancy drinks they probably couldn't afford. The irony was delicious, but I kept my expression neutral. They were all trying so hard to look successful and put together, but I could see the desperation underneath performance. Finally, Dad cleared his throat and started his presentation. He'd brought charts printed from his home computer showing property values in the neighborhood he wanted to invest in. The numbers looked impressive until you realized he'd cherry-picked the data from the best possible time frame. Sarah had apparently done extensive research on the rental market, and they were confident this was a can't-miss opportunity. Mom's pitch was more emotional. She talked about family legacy and how Grandpa Joe would have wanted us to stick together. She mentioned how proud she was of my success, and how she knew I'd grown up to be the kind of person who cared about family. Derek chimed in with statistics about college costs and how investment in education was always a smart financial move. They were both dancing around the actual ask, but the message was clear. Dad wanted me to invest in his rental property scheme. Mom and Derek needed help with various family expenses. They didn't know the exact amount of my inheritance, but they'd obviously done enough research to know it was substantial. The beautiful thing was watching them try to make it sound like they were doing me a favor. Dad kept talking about how this was a chance for us to be business partners, to really reconnect as father and son. Mom framed it as an opportunity for me to be part of a real family again, to help the people who'd always loved me even when times were tough. I let them finish their presentations, nodding thoughtfully and asking a few questions to keep them talking. The more they revealed about their financial situations, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about wanting some extra cash. These people were drowning in debt and bad decisions, and they saw me as their life preserver. Dad owed money on 3 different credit cards and had taken out a second mortgage on his place with Sarah. Mom and Derek were behind on their house payments and facing possible foreclosure. Brandon needed a car. Ashley needed college tuition, and apparently everyone needed me to solve their problems with my grandfather's money. When they finally ran out of steam, I took a sip of my coffee and looked at each of them in turn. These people who treated me like an inconvenient expense for years were now sitting across from me with their hands out, expecting me to bankroll their various disasters. I told them exactly what I thought about their sudden interest in having a relationship with me. How convenient it was that they'd remembered I existed right around the time they'd learned about my inheritance. How transparent their motivations were, and how insulting they apparently thought I was that I wouldn't see right through their performance. Dad tried to interrupt with some nonsense about how family relationships are complicated and how he'd always cared about me. Mom started tearing up and talking about how she'd made mistakes, but family was supposed to forgive each other. Derek, to his credit, mostly just sat there looking uncomfortable, probably realizing he'd signed up for more drama than he bargained for. I stood up, left a 20 on the table for my coffee and their fancy drinks, and told them this was the last conversation we'd ever have. They could keep their apologies and their explanations. I had Linda, I had my own life, and I had a grandfather who'd show me more love and respect in death than they'd managed while they were actually supposed to be raising me. Walking away from that coffee shop was one of the most liberating moments of my life. I could hear Mom call my name as I got in my car, but I didn't look back. These people had made their choices years ago when they decided their new relationships were more important than their son. Now they had to live with the consequences. The best part? Linda was waiting at home with Chinese takeout and a bottle of wine to celebrate. She'd known this day was coming and had already prepared her own celebration for my newfound freedom from toxic family obligations. 6 months later, I moved to a different city and changed my phone number. I kept in touch with Linda, obviously, but as far as my parents were concerned, I'd vanished from their lives as completely as they'd vanished from mine when I actually needed them. The inheritance has been life-changing, but not in the way my parents probably imagined. I've started my own business, bought a house, and built relationships with people who actually value me as a person rather than a potential source of income. Most importantly, I've learned that family isn't about blood relationships or legal obligations. It's about people who show up when you need them and stick around even when there's nothing in it for them. My parents probably still tell people that their son is ungrateful and selfish, that they don't understand why I won't help family in their time of need. What they'll never understand is that they stopped being my family the day they decided I was less important than their new lives. Grandpa Joe understood that, and his gift wasn't just money. It was validation that I'd been right to expect better from the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally. So that's my story, Reddit. Sometimes the best thing you can do for toxic people is give them exactly what they've been asking for all along, a life without you in it. Thanks for sticking with me through this whole crazy story. I know it's a lot, but sometimes life throws you these situations that seem too unbelievable to be real. What do you think about how I handled everything? Should I have given them another chance? Or was I right to cut them off completely? If you enjoyed this story, please consider hitting that subscribe button and leaving a comment below. I love reading your thoughts and experiences. And if you have similar family drama stories, drop them in the comments because apparently misery loves company. Thanks for being such an awesome community, and I'll catch you in the next video.